The difference was the asset. Picture the scene again. It is 1923 in the Weimar Republic. A retired civil servant stands in line at a bakery in Berlin. In his briefcase is a stack of paper marks that once represented a lifetime of discipline. 5 years earlier, that same stack could have purchased a comfortable house. Now it will not buy a loaf of bread. Across the street, a jeweler opens a small leather pouch. Inside are gold coins he purchased in 1919 when inflation first began to stir. He removes one coin, walks into a shop, and trades it for a month's worth of groceries. 2 men, 2 choices, 2 outcomes that will define their families for decades. The difference between them was not intelligence. It was not access to secret information. It was not luck. It was the structure of the asset they held. Throughout history, governments under fiscal stress face the same fundamental constraint. They need resources. And when they cannot generate those resources through growth, they turn to the only tools available. They tax, they seize, or they inflate. Taxation requires compliance and administrative control. Seizure requires visibility and force. Inflation requires only control of the currency. Inflation is the quietest method. It does not arrive with soldiers at the door. It arrives through policy, through gradual erosion, through numbers that grow larger while purchasing power grows smaller. From Roman emperors shaving silver from coins, to revolutionary governments printing paper promises, to modern central banks expanding balance sheets, the mechanism changes. The logic does not. When a state inflates, anything denominated in its currency becomes vulnerable. Savings accounts, government bonds, pensions, insurance policies. They are not physical wealth. They are claims. And claims depend entirely on the stability of the issuing authority. History reveals a pattern so consistent, it becomes difficult to ignore. Assets tied directly to government currency tend to suffer first and hardest when crisis arrives. Assets that exist outside that currency, land that produces food, tools that create goods, businesses that generate cash flow, precious metals held privately, foreign claims beyond a single jurisdiction, tend to endure, not because they are magical, because they do not depend solely on political restraint. The Weimar pensioner held a claim, the jeweler held an asset. One relied on government discipline, the other relied on physical scarcity and market demand. This distinction, claim versus asset, denomination versus production, visibility versus portability, forms the foundation of every wealth survival story across collapsing empires. Rome learned it, medieval merchants learned it, Spanish silver miners learned it, French revolutionaries learned it, Germans in 1923 learned it the hard way. The pattern does not require panic to study, it requires clarity. When governments lose control of their currencies, wealth does not disappear equally. It migrates. Understanding where it migrates and why is not speculation. It is historical observation. And that observation begins with a simple question. When pressure builds, does your wealth exist as a promise or as something that stands independent of the promise itself? When currency fails, production remains. The Roman Empire did not collapse in a single day. It eroded. In 64 AD, after the Great Fire of Rome, Emperor Nero faced a fiscal crisis. Rebuilding the capital required enormous funds. Rather than dramatically raising taxes or openly confiscating property, Nero chose the quieter path. He reduced the silver content of the denarius from roughly 95% to about 85%. The coin still looked the same. It still bore the imperial stamp, but it contained less real metal. Future emperors continued the process. By the middle of the 3rd century, the denarius contained barely 5% silver. What had once been a reliable store of value became a bronze token washed thinly in silver. Prices rose. Confidence deteriorated, trade slowed, but something important did not change. A field that produced grain in 64 AD still produced grain in 265 AD. A herd of livestock still bred, a workshop still crafted tools. The currency was debased. The productive capacity of land and labor was not. This is the first structural lesson history teaches. Currency is a measuring tool. Production is the underlying substance. When the measuring tool fails, the substance remains. During the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome endured nearly 50 emperors in fewer than 50 years. Civil wars, invasions, plagues. Each new claimant to the throne needed to pay soldiers quickly, and the easiest way to do so was to mint more debased coin. Inflation accelerated. Official prices lost meaning. Barter reemerged in many regions. Soldiers sometimes demanded payment in goods rather than currency, yet large landowners did not vanish. Their estates continued to generate wheat, olives, wine, livestock. Food retained value regardless of the silver content stamped on a coin. Rome could debase metal within its mint. It could not debase the fertility of soil. This distinction reshaped the empire's social structure. Wealth concentrated increasingly in land. By the late empire, massive estates dominated economic life, eventually evolving into the medieval manorial system. Paper promises did not survive. Productive land did. The same pattern repeats whenever monetary frameworks weaken. When currency loses credibility, value migrates toward assets with utility independent of the currency, production becomes the anchor. This does not mean land is immune to risk. Empires can seize property. Armies can burn fields. But debasement, inflation, and monetary manipulation cannot destroy the underlying productive capacity of real assets. The Roman who held coin saw his purchasing power erode gradually. The Roman who held land adjusted prices upward and continued harvesting. The state could tax him, it could threaten him, but it could not print more farmland. When analyzing asset survival across history, the first dividing line is simple. Does the asset depend on the stability of a currency, or does it produce value regardless of the currency's condition? Rome answers clearly. When governments debase, production outlives denomination. And that pattern would repeat again and again across centuries. Visibility is vulnerability. If Rome teaches us about debasement, medieval Europe teaches us about confiscation. During the 100 Years' War, English kings needed extraordinary sums to finance campaigns in France. When taxation proved insufficient and borrowing became unsustainable, the crown faced a familiar choice: raise revenue, or take it. In 1290, Edward the Firm expelled Jewish communities from England and confiscated their property. In the 1530s, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and seized perhaps 1/5 of all English land. These were not subtle monetary maneuvers. They were direct transfers of wealth backed by law and force, and they reveal a second principle. Assets that are visible, registered, and immobile are easier to seize than those that are portable and discrete. Monastic lands were recorded, boundaries were known, titles were documented. A royal decree was enough to transfer ownership, but gold coins buried in a field, jewelry sewn into clothing, gemstones hidden inside walls, those required discovery. The transaction cost of finding and seizing thousands of concealed, divisible assets was far higher than confiscating estates listed in official records. This is not an argument against land. It is an observation about structure. Land is productive, but it is also visible. Banks can freeze accounts, governments can nationalize industries, titles can be transferred with signatures. Portable wealth behaves differently. Throughout history, merchant families who sensed political risk often converted holdings into gold, silver, or gemstones. Precisely because those assets could cross borders quietly, they could be divided, hidden, moved. The crown could confiscate what it could see. It struggled to confiscate what it could not trace. This pattern introduces a second structural distinction in asset survival. Not just productive versus denominated, but visible versus concealable. When states face fiscal stress, they first target what is easiest to access: registered property, financial accounts, institutional claims. Assets outside centralized registries require far more effort to capture. And during crisis, effort is scarce. Across centuries, those who preserved wealth often held a mix: immobile productive assets and mobile border crossing reserves. Production sustains you. Portability protects you. The medieval merchant understood this intuitively. History simply confirms it. When silver floods the system, if Rome teaches us about debasement and medieval England about confiscation, the Spanish Empire teaches us about inflation through abundance. In 1545, vast silver deposits were discovered at Potosi in present-day Bolivia. What followed was one of the greatest monetary expansions in history. Between 1500 and 1650, European silver supplies increased severalfold. Ships loaded with bullion crossed the Atlantic year after year. At first, it appeared to make Spain unstoppable. The empire funded wars, built fleets, expanded territory. Silver seemed to guarantee power, but something more subtle was happening. Prices in Spain rose dramatically, wages lagged, domestic manufacturing struggled to compete. Spanish goods became expensive relative to other European nations. Silver increased the money supply. It did not automatically increase productive capacity. This is the third structural lesson. An asset that stores value is not the same as an asset that compounds value. Spain mined silver. The Dutch built ships. Merchants in Amsterdam, Antwerp, and London received Spanish silver in trade, but invested it. They financed voyages, built trading companies, developed insurance markets, and constructed infrastructure that generated cash flow independent of silver. By 1669, the Dutch East India Company was arguably the most valuable enterprise in the world. Spain possessed the metal. The Dutch built productive systems. Over time, productivity outperformed accumulation. Silver preserved wealth. Production multiplied it. And here the framework deepens. Some assets defend against monetary collapse. Others generate resilience across regimes. Precious metals protect against currency debasement. Productive businesses protect against stagnation. Jurisdictional flexibility protects against localized political failure. Spain's experience reveals a limitation of relying solely on stored wealth. If wealth is hoarded, but not deployed productively, it can distort an economy. Inflation in Spain eroded purchasing power despite the constant inflow of metal. The metal was real, but without disciplined allocation, it failed to produce enduring dominance. This distinction matters. And when analyzing survival assets, the question is not only will it hold value during collapse, it is also does it produce value when stability returns? History suggests the strongest frameworks combine both. Portable stores of value to survive currency stress. Productive assets to compound wealth across generations. Silver alone did not save Spain from decline. Productive investment built Dutch prosperity. Preservation prevents destruction. Production builds legacy. The most durable wealth strategies recognize the difference. Paper backed by land, a cautionary tale from history. In 1789, revolutionary France faced bankruptcy. The monarchy had collapsed under immense debt, the treasury was empty, and confidence in the new government was fragile. Yet, revolutionary leaders believed they had discovered an elegant solution to their financial woes. They decided to confiscate church lands and issue paper currency, the assignat, backed by that land. In theory, the system was disciplined. These paper notes were claims on tangible property. Citizens could use assignats to purchase confiscated land. As land was sold, currency would be retired. Inflation, they believed, would remain contained. But theory rarely survives political pressure. The government soon discovered that printing paper was far easier than managing restraint. More assignats were issued than land could reasonably absorb. War expenditures mounted. Fiscal discipline eroded. Between 1789 and 1796, billions of livres worth of assignats flooded the economy. This far exceeded the value of the confiscated property. Prices rose and confidence fell dramatically. By 1796, assignats had lost nearly all purchasing power. They were virtually worthless. A note that once purchased a horse would not even buy a horseshoe. The value had vanished. Once again, a clear pattern emerged from this historical event. Urban workers and pensioners who held savings in assignats were utterly devastated. Their wealth existed as paper, denominated in a rapidly collapsing system. But peasants who had converted early assignats into land ownership endured the crisis. The land still produced grain and livestock, unaffected by the currency's collapse. Merchants who exchanged assignats for gold or silver preserved their purchasing power. Those who transferred wealth into foreign assets escaped the full impact of domestic inflation. The government could print assignats, but it could not print farmland. It could not manufacture gold. This episode reinforces two critical distinctions. First, backing a currency with an asset does not guarantee discipline. Political necessity often overrides monetary restraint. Second, converting depreciating paper into productive or scarce assets early creates asymmetrical protection. Timing matters. Those who waited until confidence fully collapsed found themselves trapped. Those who exchanged paper claims for tangible assets while the currency still functioned maintained their position. The French Revolution illustrates that even when currency is theoretically asset-backed, political incentives can override design. When governments control issuance, the temptation to expand supply remains constant. Assignats were not fraudulent at inception. They became destructive through overextension. The peasants who acquired land did not predict hyperinflation precisely. They recognized a structural truth. Paper is dependent. Land is independent. This fundamental difference is key, and when fiscal stress escalates, independence becomes survival. Across Rome, medieval England, Spain, and France, this pattern continues refining itself through history. Denominated claims weaken first, productive, scarce, or portable assets endure. The structure of the asset determines its fate, not the optimism surrounding it. When the government disappears, the American Civil War reveals a different dimension of asset survival. Sometimes currency does not merely inflate. Sometimes the issuing government ceases to exist. Between 1861 and 1865, the Confederacy financed its war effort largely through paper currency and bonds. As the war dragged on, printing accelerated. Inflation followed. By 1865, Confederate dollars were effectively worthless. But the deeper issue was not inflation alone. It was extinction. When the Confederacy lost the war, the government backing its currency vanished overnight. There was no authority left to honor debts, no treasury to redeem bonds, no central institution to restore confidence. Confederate currency did not just decline, it died. This introduces another structural principle. Financial claims are only as durable as the institutions that enforce them. Union currency, the greenbacks, also inflated during the war. Prices rose significantly, but the Union government survived. It maintained authority, tax capacity, and political continuity. Greenbacks stabilized after the war. Confederate notes became souvenirs. The same physical structure, printed paper, produced radically different outcomes based on institutional survival. And yet, beneath the monetary collapse in the South, something endured. Land remained. Though plantations were burned and infrastructure damaged, acreage did not disappear. By the 1880s, many southern lands were again producing cotton and crops. Physical capital could be rebuilt. Paper claims could not. This distinction separates temporary volatility from permanent destruction. When a currency inflates, but the government survives, stabilization is possible. When a government collapses entirely, denominated claims evaporate with it. But tangible assets with intrinsic utility often outlive political structures. The Civil War also illustrates jurisdictional risk. Holding Confederate bonds was not simply an investment decision. It was a bet on which political entity would prevail. And when that bet failed, so did the asset. This lesson echoes throughout history. Assets tied to a single political structure carry concentrated risk. Assets that retain utility regardless of which flag flies overhead demonstrate resilience. The Southern landowner who held acres of farmland suffered immensely during the war. But once peace returned, production resumed. The Confederate bondholder had nothing to resume. Here, the framework sharpens further. Inflation risk, seizure risk, institutional survival risk. Every asset sits somewhere within those dimensions. The Civil War reminds us that survival is not only about price stability, it is about structural continuity. If the authority behind an asset disappears, so does the claim, but fields still grow crops. Factories can be rebuilt. Skills remain embedded in human capital. Paper promises depend on institutions. Physical assets depend on reality. And reality tends to outlast politics. When denomination becomes destruction, the German hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923 is often remembered for its absurdity. Wheelbarrows of money, children stacking banknotes like toys, postage stamps costing billions of marks. But beneath the spectacle lies a structural lesson that repeats across collapses. It was not inflation alone that destroyed wealth, it was denomination. In 1918, a German pensioner with savings in marks held what appeared to be security. Bank accounts, insurance policies, bonds, all denominated in the national currency. By late 1923, those claims had become meaningless. A life insurance payout that once could have supported a family for years could not buy a meal. A government bond worth thousands in 1919 was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Nothing physical had vanished. Factories still stood. Fields still produced grain. Skills still existed. What disappeared was purchasing power, because purchasing power was tied entirely to the mark. Meanwhile, Germans who had converted savings into gold, foreign currency, or productive property preserved relative wealth. A landlord could adjust rents daily. A factory owner could reprice goods hourly. A merchant with foreign currency could import food. The hyperinflation did not destroy everything. It destroyed anything denominated in marks. This distinction is critical. An asset's vulnerability during collapse is not determined solely by its form, but by its unit of account. If its value is measured exclusively in a failing currency, it falls with that currency. If its value can float independent of that unit, it survives. Real estate maintained relative value because its worth was not intrinsic to the mark. A building had utility regardless of what the mark represented. Gold preserved purchasing power because it was priced globally, not domestically. Foreign currency accounts provided insulation because they existed outside the collapsing monetary system. The German middle class, heavily dependent on savings accounts and fixed income instruments, suffered most. Industrialists with tangible assets endured. One survivor later recalled selling a single silver coin to buy a month's worth of food, while neighbors with substantial bank balances went hungry. This was not speculation, it was structural asymmetry. The hyperinflation teaches that diversification is not merely about asset classes. It is about denomination exposure. When the unit of account collapses, every asset tied exclusively to that unit collapses with it. Those with claims only inside the system are trapped inside the system. Those with assets outside the system maintain optionality. Denomination determines fate. And in every historical collapse, the dividing line between survival and ruin runs directly through that distinction. Jurisdiction is a layer of protection. Late 20th century currency crises did not unfold in ancient empires or revolutionary governments. They occurred in modern nation-states with central banks, regulatory systems, and international institutions. Argentina, Brazil, the Soviet Union, Zimbabwe, different cultures, different political systems, the same structural pattern. In Argentina, repeated currency resets wiped out peso savings again and again. Citizens who held deposits in domestic banks saw their purchasing power evaporate through inflation or capital controls. At times, bank withdrawals were restricted entirely. Money existed on paper. It could not be accessed. But Argentinians who held US dollars outside the domestic banking system preserved wealth. Those who owned productive farmland or export-oriented businesses could earn foreign currency and insulate themselves from local collapse. The distinction was not intelligence. It was jurisdiction. Wealth held solely within one monetary system carries the full risk of that system. Wealth diversified across borders carries optionality. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 provides another example. Ruble savings accumulated over decades became nearly worthless during the transition. Pensions denominated in rubles lost value rapidly. Citizens dependent on state payments saw their standard of living collapse. Yet individuals with access to foreign currency, ownership of hard assets, or stakes in export-driven enterprises fared differently. When the domestic unit failed, assets connected to international markets retained value. Zimbabwe offers perhaps the clearest modern illustration. Between 2007 and 2009, inflation reached levels where prices doubled within days. The government eventually printed a $100 trillion note. It became symbolic of monetary breakdown. Citizens paid in Zimbabwean dollars were destroyed financially. Savings accounts vanished in practical terms. But gold miners selling output internationally, farmers exporting tobacco, and businesses transacting in foreign currencies survived. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its currency and adopted foreign ones. The economy did not disappear. The domestic unit of account did. These examples introduce a further structural layer. Asset survival is not only about form, land, gold, business. It is about legal and monetary domain. Where is the asset recognized? Under which jurisdiction? Denominated in which currency? A bank account in a collapsing system is vulnerable regardless of the balance. A productive enterprise earning global revenue retains resilience, even if located domestically. Jurisdiction adds dimension to the framework. Local currency exposure increases risk concentration. Cross-border exposure distributes risk. The families who navigated late 20th century crises most successfully were not necessarily wealthy in advance. They were diversified across asset types, across denominations, across jurisdictions. When one system failed, another remained accessible. Collapse rarely destroys everything simultaneously. It concentrates damage within a particular framework. Those positioned partially outside that framework retain maneuverability. And maneuverability during systemic stress becomes survival. The 5 survival principles across Rome, medieval England, Spain, revolutionary France, Civil War America, Weimar Germany, Argentina, and Zimbabwe, the details change. The currencies differ, the governments differ, the triggers differ, but the pattern remains remarkably stable. When fiscal stress rises and governments reach for taxation, seizure, or inflation, wealth does not vanish evenly. It redistributes along structural lines. From these case studies, 5 principles emerge. First, production outlives denomination. Assets that generate goods or services independent of currency maintain relevance when currency falters. Land that grows food, businesses that create value, skills that produce income, these endure because they are rooted in utility, not in accounting units. Second, portability resists confiscation. Registered and immobile assets are easier to target. Portable, divisible assets that can move across borders increase flexibility. Visibility invites policy. Mobility creates options. Third, denomination determines vulnerability. If an asset's value exists solely within a failing unit of account, it falls with that unit. If it is priced globally or tied to physical scarcity, it retains reference points outside the collapsing framework. Fourth, jurisdiction concentrates or distributes risk. Wealth held entirely within one political or monetary system absorbs the full risk of that system. Diversification across borders, legal, monetary, operational, introduces resilience. Fifth, timing transfers wealth. Those who convert claims into durable assets early preserve position. Those who wait until confidence evaporates often discover that exit doors narrow quickly. These principles are not ideological. They are observational. In Weimar Germany, gold holders did not become richer because gold soared in some abstract sense. They maintained purchasing power while paper claims dissolved, creating a relative advantage that compounded over time. In revolutionary France, peasants who acquired land early survived inflation. Those who trusted paper promises until the end were trapped. In Argentina and Zimbabwe, access to foreign currency was not speculation. It was insulation. The framework is structural. Is the asset productive or merely denominated? Is it portable or fully registered? Is it tied to one jurisdiction or diversified? Does it produce value or simply store it? And perhaps most importantly, does its survival depend on government restraint? History suggests restraint is often abandoned under pressure, not maliciously, not always deliberately, but predictably. Understanding these principles does not require predicting collapse in any specific place. It requires recognizing that fiscal stress is not rare. It is recurring. The form changes. The mechanisms evolve. The underlying incentives remain. And when stress arrives, the dividing lines between durable assets and fragile claims tend to reveal themselves quickly. The question is never whether the pattern exists. It is whether one recognizes it in advance. What survives? The lesson stretching from Rome to Zimbabwe is not that collapse is constant. It is that vulnerability is structural. Currencies change. Governments rise and fall. Monetary systems evolve from metal coins to paper notes to digital ledgers, yet the underlying tension remains the same. When a state faces pressure, it reaches for the tools available to it. Taxation, seizure, inflation. And every asset sits somewhere along that spectrum of exposure. The Roman who trusted the denarius learned that debasement is quiet but relentless. The medieval landowner learned that visibility invites confiscation. The Spanish crown learned that metal without productive deployment erodes advantage. The French citizen learned that paper backed by land can still be overissued. The Confederate bondholder learned that when a government disappears, so do its promises. The Weimar pensioner learned that denomination can become destruction. The Argentine saver learned that jurisdiction concentrates risk. The Zimbabwean civil servant learned that a number in an account is not the same as purchasing power. Across centuries, survival favored a consistent framework: productive capacity, scarcity, portability, jurisdictional flexibility, independence from a single political promise. This does not imply abandoning modern systems. It implies understanding their structure. Bank accounts serve purpose. Government bonds serve function. Currencies facilitate exchange, but they are tools. They are not foundations. Foundations are built on assets that exist whether policy succeeds or fails, on land that produces, on businesses that adapt, on scarce stores of value not easily replicated, on diversification across legal and monetary domains. History does not demand pessimism, it demands awareness. When stress builds, wealth migrates, from paper to production, from centralized claims to decentralized control, from concentration to diversification. Those who recognize the pattern early preserve continuity. Those who rely entirely on institutional stability discover how quickly stability can shift. The question is not whether any particular nation will collapse, it is whether your framework assumes permanence where history suggests variability. If this perspective added clarity to how you think about assets and risk, consider subscribing. These discussions are not predictions. They are examinations of recurring patterns that shape generational wealth. And if you found value here, leave a comment with which principle resonated most: production, portability, denomination, or jurisdiction. Understanding the pattern is the first step. Acting before the majority notices it is the second. History does not punish the uninformed intentionally. It simply rewards the prepared consistently.